This is a deck tech for Slurrk and Reyhan. Slurrk, the all-consuming, and Reyhan, last of the abzan. They both have partners, so there are 2 commanders to the deck. Slurrk, the all-consuming, is 5 and a green for a legendary creature ooze, and it enters the battlefield with 5 +1/+1 counters. And whenever it or another creature with a +1/+1 counter on it dies, put a +1/+1 counter on each creature with one. And it has partner. It is a 0/0. That pretty well lays out what I'm going to do with the deck. I'm going to get tons and tons of creatures with +1/+1 counters on it, and I'm going to have them die and have just tons and tons of +1/+1 counter shenanigans related to death. Let's get into it. I read off Slurrk, but the other important part of the puzzle is Reyhan. Reyhan, last of the abzan, is 1 black-green for a 0/0. It enters the battlefield with 3 +1/+1 counters on it. Whenever a creature you control dies or is put into the command zone, if it had 1 or more +1/+1 counters on it, you may put that many +1/+1 counters on target creature. Because of Slurrk, when something with a +1/+1 counter on it dies, you will put another +1/+1 counter on each creature that already had a +1/+1 counter on it. This is just a way to get tons of +1/+1 counter shenanigans. One important thing with this deck is giving all of our creatures +1/+1 counters. I've talked about how I want my creatures to die with +1/+1 counters on it so I can put more +1/+1 counters on other things. That's what the +1/+1 distribute category is for. The idea of this category is to have cards that one way or another will make it so that my creatures get +1/+1 count. One example of that would be Durable Handicraft, 1 and a green for an enchantment. Whenever a creature enters the battlefield under your control, you may pay 1. If you do, put a +1/+1 counter on that creature. This way, I can make it so that there's a +1/+1 counter on every single creature that will enter the battlefield from now on. Sometimes I won't have the mana, and sometimes it won't be worth it. But just having that option is going to make it so that all the cards in the future that we would want to sacrifice will be able to have a +1/+1 counter. It also has 5 and a green. Sacrifice Durable Handicraft. Put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control. Now that is amazing. We can either pay to get a +1/+1 counter on every single creature that will enter the battlefield, or we can just sacrifice it later for only 6 mana, and we can put a +1/+1 counter on every creature we control. Now, there are a lot of similar effects to this that will put +1/+1 counters on each creature we control, +1 counters to creatures entering the battlefield. Because those are basically the main 2 ways that we want to give counters, either by giving it to everything or by giving it to everything that will enter the battlefield. So, we have 8 cards in that category that will all fairly well distribute counters around. And with the Reyhan and the Slurrk as the commander, we already have a couple of ways to move them around. So we can reliably get almost all, if not all, of our creatures to have +1/+1 counters. How are we going to make them die? We have our creatures and we want them to die, so simple enough, of course, we have sack outlets. So these are just creatures that will allow us to sacrifice a creature. And this is going to allow us to get the Reyhan trigger, and it's going to allow us to get the Slurrk trigger. We've got 5 cards here. It's the typical ones: Carrion Feeder, Viscera Seer, Altar of Dementia, Ashnod's Altar, and Woe Strider. Those are all pretty typical for sacrifice outlets, and they're pretty good. I have the ability to sacrifice my creatures, and I know that my creatures will have +1/+1 counters on them. But what about my creatures? How am I going to get those creatures? Well, there's several ways. So the first one is by having things that will recast themselves. So one example of that would be Tenacious Dead. Black for a 1/1. When it dies, you may pay 1 in a black. If you do, return it to the battlefield tapped under its owner's control. Or Bloodghast. Black for a creature Vampire Spirit, 2/1. It has haste as long as an opponent has 10 or less life. And whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, you may return Bloodghast from your graveyard to the battlefield. So these are ways that we can cast it, sacrifice it, cast it, sacrifice it, cast it, sacrifice it, over and over and over and over again to get triggers from basically anything we would want. That's just a really good way to get us to be able to use something over and over again just for our mana and not having to cast entire creatures. Another way to not have to cast entire creatures is, as I'm sure you expected, token production. So token production is just making tokens. We're going to make creature tokens that we are willing to sacrifice. Now, this is a really nice category for several reasons. First of all, there's so much variation in token production that we can have things that benefit us. So we can either make the tokens whenever something we care about happens, similar to animation module, which is 1 for an artifact. Whenever 1 or more +1/+1 counters are placed on a permanent you control, you may pay 1. If you do, create a 1/1 colorless servo artifact creature token. And it has 3, tap, choose a counter on target permanent or player. Give that permanent or player another counter of that kind. So this is going to allow us to make more tokens and more servos, and it's just going to allow us to, every single time Reyhan will trigger by one of our creatures dying, we will put a +1/+1 counter on a creature. Then that will make animation module make a 1/1 servo. Every single time that one of my creatures dies, I will then get a servo, another creature to sacrifice, which will likely have another +1/+1 counter on it. So just by doing this over and over and over again, we can get a huge amount of value by A, producing more +1/+1 counters that can be spread around, and Slurrk will put a +1/+1 counter on each creature with a +1/+1 counter. So it will just make a huge number of counters. Another profitable thing we can have with this is we can make tokens with +1/+1 counters on them. This just makes it so we can kind of skip a step and makes it quite a bit easier. One example of this is Dreadlord Invasion. It's 1 and a black for an enchantment, and it says, at the beginning of your upkeep, you lose 1 life and amass 1. Put a +1/+1 counter on an army you control. If you don't control one, create a 0/0 black zombie army creature token first. And whenever a zombie creature you control with power 6 or greater attacks, it gains lifelink until end of turn. So every single turn, we can make a 0/0 zombie army with a +1/+1 counter on it. Now, if we don't sacrifice it every turn, it doesn't work as well, so it doesn't build up as well, but it is still super effective once you have your engine in place. Awakening Zone is another example of something profitable we can have. 2 and a green for enchantment. At the beginning of your upkeep, you may create a 0/1 colorless Eldrazi spawn creature token. It has sacrifice this creature, add colorless. So this is good for us in 2 ways. The first is it can sacrifice itself. We don't have to worry about having a sacrifice outlet. It just makes it so that for some reason, if we don't have that, we don't have to worry about it. And the second thing is it makes us mana. Having mana is just always good. So the rest of these cards basically fit into those categories. Either it makes us mana and allows us to sacrifice itself, it makes us a token that already has counters on it, or it will make tokens every time we do something we care about. I'm going to give one more example because it's really powerful. Iridescent Horn Beetle is 4 and a green for 3/4. At the beginning of your end step, create a 1/1 green insect creature token for each +1/+1 counter you've put on creatures under your control this turn. So this is just really good because it allows us to make insects for each +1/+1 counter we're putting on creatures, which are just 2 things we really care about. We've established that we have creatures we can sacrifice, and we can put +1/+1 counters on them, and we can sacrifice them. So we're just producing tons and tons of counters. So let's make more. So +1/+1 addition is a category that is either taking creatures that already have +1/+1 counters on them and giving them more, or it's making it so that every +1/+1 counter we place on something, it becomes, that many +1 or that many times 2. It's just going to make it so that it becomes more and more and more over time. One example of that is Hardened Scales. Hardened Scales is green for an enchantment. If 1 or more +1/+1 counters would be put on a creature you control, that many +1/+1/+1 counters are put on it instead. So, with Reyhan's ability, if something dies, it's going to be moved to another creature. So it will be that many +1. And with Slurrk's ability, every single creature with a +1/+1 counter will get a +1/+1 counter. It will then get another +1/+1 counter because of Hardened Scales. That just adds up really quickly. Now I've got quite a few cards that basically do that exact thing. If it's moved, then it gets 1 additional. Another example of types of things we can have is Evolution Sage. 2 and a green for 3/2. Whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, proliferate. Choose any number of permanents and or players, then give each another counter of each kind already there. You can just make it so that there's tons and tons and tons of creatures that are getting counters. It all kind of fits in that same type of category. It's just making it so that you get even more tokens onto the creatures that already have them. Another example that is quite powerful is Corpsejack Menace. 2 black-green for 4/4. If 1 or more +1/+1 counters would be put on a creature you control, twice that many +1/+1 counters are put on it instead. This is absurd, alright? Picture let's say something dies, right? Reyhan says, okay, I'm going to move the +1/+1 counters. So there were 4 on it before. Okay, well, now there's 8. And then, you know what? Let's put it on something not valuable. And then sacrifice it. And then there's 16. And then let's sacrifice that again. Oh, 32 +1/+1 counters? That's insane. Like, the amount of +1/+1 counters you can produce if you are doubling it every single time you move it. And trust me, you're going to be doing a lot of moving these cards around, these +1/+1 counters around. If every single time you do that, it gets doubled, that's just insane. You just can create an insane amount of +1/+1 counters and put them all over all of our creatures and just beat face with it. We're going to have a huge board full of tons of creatures that have massive powers and toughnesses. And we're going to be able to be bringing things in and out and in and out and getting benefit from that. Of course, we also have ramp and draw. But this ramp and draw is also nice because we can have some synergy with our deck with it. So, first of all, we have some of the boring stuff. Elves of Deep Shadow, Elvish Mystic, Finehorn Elves, and Llanowar Elves are all a single green, and they can tap to add 1 mana of either green or black. Draga Tree Speaker is similar. It's green for creature, elf, druid, level up 1 and a green, and it's a 1/1, and it's level 1 to 4. If you level it up once, it becomes a 1/2, and you can tap it to add green to your mana pool. So all these will just allow you to add a little bit of mana. Gyre Sage is 1 and a green for a creature, elf, druid with evolve. Whenever a creature enters the battlefield under your control, if that creature has greater power or toughness than this creature, put a +1/+1 counter on this creature. And it has tap, add green for each +1/+1 counter on Gyre Sage. We've talked about how with Reyhan, we can move a huge amount of tokens onto one specific creature. And Slurrk, we can make it so that even more tokens are on that creature than before. We can just move an insane amount of tokens onto Gyre Sage and just start making 10 or 20 mana every single time we tap it, which is just going to allow us to do so much. Sakura Tribe Elder is 1 and a green for a 1/1. You can sacrifice it to search your library for a land card, then put it on the battlefield tapped. Then shuffle your library. It's just a way that you can sacrifice another thing. There are also some cards that will allow you to tap every single creature with a +1/+1 counter on it for mana. Because we're making so many tokens and so many creatures, being able to use them all for mana is just gonna be very useful. Beyond that, of course, we have draw. But again, like everything else in this deck, there's just an additional layer of synergy. Being able to take the draw that we have and have a significant portion of it either synergize with +1/+1 counters of it or synergize with sacrifice is huge. So one example of a very powerful version is Skull Clamp. It is 1 for an artifact equipment. Equipped creature gets +1, -1. And whenever a equipped creature is put into a graveyard, draw 2 cards. It has equip 1. There is also Inspiring Call, 2 and a green for an instant. Draw a card for each creature you control with a +1/+1 counter on it. Those creatures gain indestructible until end of turn. You're going to give your board protection, and you're going to get a ton of draw. There's also the things that synergize with death. Skyclave Shadowcat is 3 and a black for 3/3. Whenever a creature you control with a +1/+1 counter on it dies, draw a card. And Smothering Abomination, which is 2 black for a 4/3 with Devoid and Flying. At the beginning of your upkeep, sacrifice a creature, and whenever you sacrifice a creature, draw a card. Being able to draw a card for every single creature you sacrifice is huge. You are going to be sacrificing so many creatures just over and over again and moving those +1/+1 counters around. Being able to draw those cards is going to be huge. Beyond that, we have Other. So this is stuff that is amazing in the deck, but doesn't really fit into the cookie cutter categories that I said. Yes, I could make categories for them, but if I want to make a category for a card that has 2 cards in that category, I'm just going to make an other category. The Ozolith is 1 for Legendary Artifact. Whenever a creature you control leaves the battlefield, if it had counters on it, put those counters on the Ozolith. At the beginning of combat on your turn, if the Ozolith has counters on it, you may move all the counters from the Ozolith onto target creature. This is the same effect as Reyhan, but it's amazing for 2 reasons. 1, it stacks. You can have both of these at the same time, which means every single time something dies, you're going to get the +1/+1 counters moved with Reyhan, and you're going to get the +1/+1 counters on the Ozolith. And also, it's cheaper and just nice to have if Reyhan isn't out. Champion of Lambholt is 1 green for 1/1. Creatures with power less than or equal to Champion of Lambholt's power can't block creatures you control. And whenever another creature enters the battlefield under your control, put a +1/+1 counter on Champion of Lambholt. You can put a huge amount of +1/+1 counters on Champion of Lambholt, and then it will make your entire team unblockable. Varal's the Scar-Striped is 1 black-green for 2/2. Each creature card in your graveyard has Scavenge. The Scavenge cost is equal to its mana cost, and it has Sacrifice another creature. Regenerate Varal's the Scar-Striped. So you can sack a creature and regenerate it, which is amazing. Having a sacrifice outlet is just very useful. And you can scavenge your creatures. This is just another way to turn the things in your graveyard into +1/+1 counters. Dictative Erebos is 3 black for an enchantment with Flash. Whenever a creature you control dies, each opponent sacrifices a creature. It's just going to allow you to take all this death and make it wreak havoc on your opponents. Death's Presence is 5 and a green for enchantment. Whenever a creature you control dies, put a +1/+1 counter, put X +1/+1 counters on target creature you control, where X is the power of the creature that died. So this is, again, another way we can turn the creatures we're dying into more +1/+1 counters. Just being able to have 3 effects that will stack with our commander is huge. And plus, with +1/+1 counter doubling, it's a similar thing to having another one of these effects. So this is just a huge ability to be able to have that effect again. And, of course, we also have removal. This is just going to get rid of stuff from our opponents. We've got 6 cards in there. Whatever you want to run is very up to you. Your budget, your meta, anything really. It's very much up to you what you want to run in the removal category. That's the deck. I think this would be great. I am seriously considering building this in real life. If you do not know, I only have 4 decks, so my threshold of building a deck in real life is very, very high. Thank you for listening. Please subscribe, like, please share this, and please nominate me for the MTG Content Creator Awards thing. Please do that. It would be huge if I could get even nominated up to the top 6 people that are nominated. That would be huge for me. Thank you for listening, and I will see you next time.